This episode addresses hard topics like eating disorders, sex, and mental health disorders, so it may not be suitable for young listeners or people on the path toward healing. Hey, everybody. Jen Hatmaker here, your host of the For the Love podcast. Okay, everybody, welcome. Man, am I glad you're here. Whew. We are kicking off a brand new series today to wrap up the summer season here on For the Love. And this series is called, everybody buckle up, For the Love of Dating, Sex, and Relationships. I mean, honestly, how could we not have this series? And it's not just because I'm back in the dating pool and navigating a lot of the same things my single sisters and brothers have been navigating for years. It's also because, and let's be honest, most of us are trying to figure out relationships in general. So like whether we're married or single or straight or gay, like we want to know how to be in them, how to make them better, how to avoid the pitfalls, how to know ourselves better, how to be a better half of a relationship ourselves. I'm like, this is my this is my classroom right now. Being in a relationship with Tyler and dating and everything being new in my 40s, like new again, like another human person and new relational patterns and sex. And like, I have been handed the opportunity to learn and to grow, to examine patterns in my own life that are unhealthy and unhelpful and do them differently and have agency over how I am showing up inside a relationship. It's just been an incredible journey for me. I don't know. I've learned so much to share. And so look, we cover a lot of ground here. And the truth is, we could have probably done this series for a solid calendar year. But we have packed it into a 9-part series. And that's on the outer edges of how long we normally do a series, but there's just so much here. So I'm going to give you a little snapshot, just a touchdown, not entirely, but a snapshot of how amazing this series is going to be before we start this week's episode. And we're starting off just right. So over the course of the series, we got a bunch of stuff. We are going to be talking about everyone's favorite life activity, sarcasm, for the single crew, online dating. It's a lot. All the swiping and you guys, thank the Lord. We've got someone who's going to demystify the whole thing for us, make it more approachable and healthy. So we have dating coach Perry Schneider for an episode in this series. You're going to love her and you're going to love that conversation. So if online dating makes you sweat and you want a different route, we're also talking with a professional matchmaker who's got some stellar tips for us and how matchmakers find the perfect match. And bonus, he also specializes in connecting and creating safe places for Black people to find the love of their life. So get excited because we're talking to Joseph Dixon about all that. Then amidst all this kind of like relationship talk, we have an incredible episode discussing being single and why this choice, which can absolutely be an on purpose, wonderful, vibrant, healthy choice, is real and valid. And it has like this whole wonderful like conversation around it and community and experience. And tons of people are living their best lives apart from a romantic relationship or raising families or whatever, with like meaning and purpose and intention. I loved that conversation, and you are too, because you're going to hear insight and validation from Shani Silver on this. And we really want you to stick around for the whole series because we will cap it off with me, your Jen, spilling the tea about me and my new person, Tyler Merritt, who will also be in the final episode of the series. So you've definitely heard me talk about him. Maybe you've seen him on my socials, or maybe you heard us. We were over on Glennon's podcast together. But for our own little show, we are going to go pretty deep and talk about some stuff that no one's heard yet. And Tyler is like an open book, and like he doesn't have any sort of embarrassment about anything. So who even knows what that guy is going to end up saying? But and I might even be asking some questions you've been asking me about the two of us. And so, community, I do want to just say you have been so encouraging and protective of us both. And you've just been the safest, most wonderful place to bring a new relationship to the table. So I love you for that. And I can't wait for you guys to officially meet Tyler here in our podcast world. Okay, so can you just tell I'm a little excited about the series? It's just full. And every conversation has been like interesting and fascinating and stimulating. And we're running the gamut of all these conversations that matter to us. So to kick things off, I'm super thrilled to have a returning guest who has so much to offer in this space from a therapeutic standpoint. The first time he was on, that episode was downloaded and downloaded and downloaded and downloaded. And so we knew at the close of that, when you all kind of said back to us, we want more of this, and this conversation was too short, and we have a million other questions, that we were going to invite him back, because he is just a profoundly gifted, generous, and gracious leader in this space. You might remember Jay Stringer from our Elephant in the Room series, where he talked to us about unwanted sexual behaviors. And we very lightly touched back then on purity culture, which he and I are about to really get into it. But that's that whole Christian youth phenomenon that kind of lasted through the like late 80s and 90s, that basically painted sex as just the ultimate bad thing, and sexual feelings and sexual desire in our bodies. We were actually exalted for suppressing our normal sexual desires, obviously being virgins until we got married, young, I might add. And then, of course, for women, not being the key source of temptation for these like helpless and hapless Christian boys. It was a mess. Gosh, Jay and I talk all about it. Because lo and behold, this sort of teaching caused a bit of trauma amongst the people who were exposed to it, both men and women. It was bad for all of us. And maybe like you guys, like me, perhaps have been unraveling what it is you think about sex, how you think about sex, how you think about your body, maybe even within the confines of a loving relationship or marriage, if that's you. But because of the messages that we received about it during that formative time. So Jay and I actually both talked about how we did not get enough time the first episode to really dive into this. And he has a lot of study and research around it. Plus the work he does every day with people who have sexual fallout in their lives and relationships when they have come from this purity mindset. And so we had to have it back. And even if you were not indoctrinated into purity culture by your church or maybe other religious organizations, or even just sort of maybe a rigid sexual space in the childhood home you grew up in, this episode is for you too. We talk about all kinds of like sexual health and get real excited because we add a whole nother layer onto it, which is teaching our kids about sex. Like, how do we raise our kids without the sexual shame that a lot of us experienced, but maybe not an absolute sexual free-for-all, right? What's the third way? What is Jay and I absolutely drill down into this. And so I think you're going to love this conversation if you're parenting kids, and even if they're little. Like, he really takes us on this parenting discussion from the time they're young. And so a lot of us are working through that. For those of us who didn't have a good precedence, or we didn't have a good model to learn from personally, we're like in the Wild West right now as parents. Like, we're the parents now raising the next generation and don't have a lot of great history or experience to pull from. And so we built this interview for us in mind, how to talk to our kids in a way that is open and healthy and creates a space where they are they feel safe and connected enough to learn from us, because they are going to learn. Make no mistake, they will learn. So it's either from you or it's from their peers, but they will learn. So, all right. Back to our man of the hour. So Jay Stringer, he's a licensed mental health counselor. He's an ordained minister, and he's an internationally known speaker on the topic of unwanted sexual behavior, its source, and its impact. Also, its recovery. Oh, he's the best. He's actually spent the last decade working to research and understand all sorts of like sexual brokenness, and then what the journey to healing looks like. So his book is called Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. And it's based on the stories of almost 4,000 people, and how they unraveled their shame, and begin to understand where their own unwanted behaviors were coming from. And exciting news for all of us, he has been given a grant to do a whole new round of research for another book, which is so great for us. We cannot have enough good voices in the world talking about this, and collating others' experiences to give us guidance. And honestly, Jay is at the top. He's one of the best. He's also a leading researcher and guide for folks specifically that have left or experienced purity culture. And so, which he experienced it too as a kid. So he's got personal experience to offer. Y'all, anyway, this is such a good conversation. We went way too long. We had so much to say. He talks to us as adults who are reimagining or reinventing like what a beautiful, healthy sex life could look like at any age. And then he talks to us as parents, and it is packed, and you're going to love it, and you're going to love him. And I am absolutely so pleased to bring my second conversation with the wonderful, the smart, the generous Jay Stringer. All right. Well, good morning. Welcome back. I'm so happy to see you.
Good morning, Jen. So good to be back.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming back, Jay. Our first episode that we were just talking about, which we did last fall, was very, very, very downloaded. A very downloaded episode. And everyone, like me and my podcast team, and then my listening community, was like, we needed more of that conversation, and it ended too soon. And there was other things we wanted to hear him talk about. And we're like, well, we have his number. Like, he can come back. It's a free country.
I have a choice.
You have a choice. We know where you live. So thank you for hearing our request for an encore. So the first time, Jay, that you and I had a conversation here, we were sort of diving into maybe the bread and butter of your work, which is kind of a conversation around sexual brokenness. You've done a lot of really profound work here, research here. We talked about other things as well. We touched on the purity culture phenomenon. And you and I discussed how we were actually both affected by that growing up, and the lingering damage that it has on us as adults, like, and adults navigating sex, whether they're in the same like relationship or marriage they've been in all this time, or they're like me and they're starting over with a new partner, with a new everything. And it factors in. It does. So if you'll just indulge me quickly, for anybody listening who's like, what does that mean? Like, I am aware that we grew up in a certain space. This is not necessarily ubiquitous.
Bizarre space. Not
it's
just
bizarre.
Bizarre.
Thank you. Yes. I appreciate that adjective. That's fair.
But extremely bizarre.
That's with that lead in. Can you sort of talk about purity culture, how it caught on, how it grew, and then we'll move on to what we do in its wake. But can you just sort of lay the foundation here for kind of what we're going to be talking about?
Sure. So purity culture began in the early 1990s with this encouragement to young men and women to abstain from sex and to remain chaste until marriage. That was kind of the working definition of it. But to do so, purity culture became a whole industry with like all the merch that you can imagine. So there were purity pledges where young men and women would kind of make this pledge to remain pure, which meant no sex until marriage. And then they would have purity rings that people would get. And to me, one of the most bizarre would be purity balls, where essentially fathers would get all dressed up with their daughters and go to this dance around the subject of their daughter's virginity. So
when you just say it on its face, it's so upsetting. It's so weird and a little bit gross, even like, what in the world?
Yes. Yeah. And so it started getting a lot of momentum when Lifeway Christian Resources started the True Love Waits campaign. And then the Southern Baptists got involved as well. And this was their form of sex education. And so just right off the bat, I want you to be aware of the lack of sex education in Christian sex education. So this was the start of it. Joshua Harris, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Right. So all of this was beginning. But what I like to say is I went through puberty while attending a Southern Baptist high school in Virginia. And two potentially quick stories would just be, they would divide men or adolescent boys and girls. And so I was in rural Virginia, at least where the high school was. And so we had speakers come through from a very well-known Christian university in Virginia. And so, and this is going to be a little bit graphic, but essentially
that's what we're doing here.
This teacher sat all the adolescent boys down and said, I want to tell you all a story. And he talked about the Inuit people. He referred to them as Eskimos. And he said, I want to tell you a story about essentially the Inuit people. And what they would do is they, in order to protect their camp from wolves, would dip a knife or a dagger into seal's blood and leave this dagger outside of the camp. And so as the wolves would come in, they would start licking this dagger that had seal's blood, and it would lick and lick and lick. And lo and behold, it couldn't discern what was seal's blood versus the blood of its own mouth. And in the morning, there would be a dead wolf. And no lie, this 22-year-old...
I'm trying to find it.
I know you don't. Yeah. This 22-year-old turned and said, there are a lot of you boys that are masturbating and having sex. And I'm telling you, it feels good right now. But in the morning, you're going to be dead. And I was a senior. My dad was a Presbyterian minister. So I had enough like decent
You're going to be dead.
Yeah, like spiritually dead in the morning. And so I remember like turning my head and looking at all the middle school and underclassmen, and they were just horrified. And I mean, in that moment, he just consigned our entire school to sexual shame. So that was one story. Another story was when I was a senior, I was the student body president of my high school. And as I just referenced, my parents were Presbyterian. So, I mean, we didn't have a lot of movement and playfulness, but I was at least allowed to dance. And so we couldn't plan a dance at our school. We had to plan it off campus. And so I ended up planning this dance with the rest of the student council off campus. And the head of the school called me down into his office and said, I heard you're planning this dance, and I want you to know some of my concerns that I have. And I said, what are your concerns? And he basically asked me to imagine my homecoming date and dancing very close to her. And he asked me if he thought that I could remain sexually pure as I danced and slow danced with my date. And it was just one of those moments where I obviously didn't have a lot of language for it as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, but just that sense of my thoughts were no cleaner, no purer than yours. So there's just a lot of those. And adolescent girls had it so much worse. Their sexuality was compared to a flower.
That's right.
Or this lollipop that, if you let someone touch you or kiss you or go all the way, then you would just kind of give away your flower and essentially leave your husband with damaged goods. And we can talk
That's right.
a lot more about how this affected women later on, because I see it in really severe, damaging ways. But those were some intro stories into the purity movement.
I mean, we had virtually identical coming of age stories at the same time, in the same sort of the new. I remember getting our True Love Waits workbook, and to your very good point, the extensiveness of the sexual ed piece was don't have it. And that's the end of that. So there was just nowhere to go, and the shame around what are just normal, healthy, like a sexual awakening at that age. But then also, like, for girls, our bodies, like I had the flower talk where all the petals were plucked off and they held out a dead stick. This is what you give your husband when you give all your petals to the boyfriends. And then I also had, and this was a lovely metaphor that, you don't easily forget. I don't even
know if I can bear it.
No, I know. I know you've heard it, but it's like, we didn't know where it was coming because we didn't know that this particular youth group lesson was going to be sex related. So we were unwitting participants in the demonstration, which was just passing a cup of like water around so everybody could spit in it. Just spit in it and pass it and give it to the next person. We all spit in it. We thought, I don't know. And then, of course, as it turns out, that was us. We were the cup with everybody's spit in it because we let somebody like put their hand up our shirt. You know what I mean? Or God, we wanted them to, even worse. And
these are the moments where I'm like, what planet are we from?
What planet are we from? But of course, we're all like, right. Like, that's gross. We're gross. We are gross. And we don't want to be the spit cup. That's not what we want to be. And so we wrapped these behaviors around that, which was primarily just, we were all still having sex. We were just deeply ashamed about it and hiding it and pretending that we weren't. We had no healthy anything attached to it. Conversation, practices, guardrail, nothing. I mean, we didn't have, nobody taught us that. They just said, don't have it. And so
no education.
None. So we're laughing because it's so bizarre, but like this harmed us. It harmed us.
Incredibly.
This whole generation. And so I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, because of course this is your adult work. You now work with adults who are trying to unravel some of these just the worst messaging around sex that I can't hardly think of a worse one. And you're helping us be free and healthy and even recovered. I don't think that's too strong a word. Can you talk more about how growing up in that narrative affected men? And then how it affected women based on what you see and have experienced.
So, I wrote a book titled Unwanted. And what I was trying to do was to provide a third way from just the evangelical lust management approach. And so what evangelical language did was essentially, terrified of sexual desire, drunk on their own self-righteousness, trying to avoid unwanted behaviors. And on its best day, it was a sincere attempt to honor God. But there was also the sense of like, we need internet monitoring. We need to kind of bounce our eyes. Again, notice that it wasn't the invitation for men to actually see women and to move through all of their crap. It was bounce your eyes from women. Right. And so I did some research on about 4,000 men and women to get a sense of what was driving all of this. And what we found was that unwanted sexual behavior, like the use of pornography, extramarital affairs, men who buy sex, those behaviors could be predicted based in the unresolved stories of people's lives. And so the big implication in my work is that sexual difficulties are not a life sentence to sexual shame. They are a roadmap to healing. And so the research that I did looked at basically showing that you could predict people's porn preferences and unwanted sexual behaviors based in their unresolved story. So that was, that's most of the work that I do. But the background of a lot of this throughout history has been, when we think about someone like Augustine, who was a very brilliant theologian, what we know about his backstory is that he was struggling with sexual compulsivity. So he would write in his confessions, "The frenzy gripped me and I surrendered myself entirely to lust." And so, internet porn obviously wasn't around back in that day. And so he was struggling with orgies, lots of hookups. And I referenced that story because he has shaped our Western understanding of sex more than any other person on the planet. That's where the purity movement comes from. So if you hate your sexual desire and you are militantly trying to stop it, you are going to develop a very severe and harmful theology. And that's exactly what happened. Is Augustine's self-hatred for a sexual struggle set up so many people. So that was, a lot of men were invited to see that they were just always going to struggle with this lust. It was every man's battle. It was something that you needed to militantly fight, but it was so much worse for women. So in my work, I've seen the purity culture really affect women in three particular ways. I would say that it deprioritizes women's sexual pleasure. It set women up for sexual violation. And then the third is that it contributed to sexual pain. So the first one would be purity movement really deprioritized sexual pleasure, and that men were kind of told that they are the sexual ones, and women, they're not full of sexual desire. They don't really want it. It's really a man's desire. And this completely ignored that the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings, which is more than double that of a penis. So they were basically, deprioritizing women's pleasure and sexuality. So what this has led to is, Sheila Gregoire, her work, her book is The Great Sex Rescue. One of the things she talks about is just the orgasm gap in heterosexual couples. And about 95% of men will orgasm either every time or almost every time. But for women, it's more in the range of about 45 to 47%. So we have something like a 47, 48% orgasm gap within heterosexual couples. And what Sheila's research showed is that the primary reason for that is a lack of foreplay in women, because the orbit is always around a man's sexual pleasure. So, and then the second thing that I've noticed, and this is the most damaging, is that it really set women up for sexual violation. Sexual purity culture 100%. Does not have any language for consent, and that is highly problematic and damaging. So what they have language for is right and wrong, pure and impure, premarital sex or marital sex. So what do you do if you are dating a boyfriend or in a relationship with someone where they begin to pressure you, manipulate you, coerce you into sex? The woman in that situation, the adolescent girl, takes the blame not only for her own abuse, but also for the lust of this man. It's absolute chaos. The second thing that I've seen happen a lot is, this is from the book Every Man's Battle, which was kind of the referred resource before my time. My book was definitely an attempt to try and correct so much of that damaging language. But one of the things that it told women and men is that essentially when a man is trying to leave porn behind, the man needs to view his wife as a merciful vial of methadone. And again, one of those things where I could laugh, I could cry, I could scream, I could rip some shit up. It's infuriating. And so, what that did to sexual entitlement with men and women, how that really killed desire and intimacy. Because for desire to grow, there has to be the ability to say no in order to give a meaningful yes to something. And so if you are just a merciful vial of methadone, how can you truly say yes? And then the third thing that I referenced would just be it contributed to sexual pain in women. There is a condition called vaginismus, which I'm not blaming purity culture on vaginismus entirely, but it's a sexual pain condition where essentially the walls, the vaginal wall collapse, and it makes sex very difficult, if not impossible. And so one of the things that we have found is that about 22% of women are struggling with vaginismus.
22%? Gosh.
At some point in their life, I think, is the research. And then about 7% to the degree to which sex is impossible. And what Sheila Gregoire's research showed is that evangelical women struggle with this almost twice the amount of the general population. And so it's just one of those things where, it's almost Pavlovian, that if you have been convinced time and time again that all sexual arousal within you is bad, and definitely the sexual arousal of someone that you're with is problematic and you're responsible for, it's going to lead to a lot of sexual difficulties later in life. And so those three are the most common that I see in terms of the impact with women. So just to underscore, very, very damaging and just heartbreaking when you start seeing the debris that the purity culture has disseminated.
It's sobering just to hear you walk it through. Of course, and I am a woman who emerged from that culture, and I lead women who did. So I corroborate every word that you've just said. These are conversations that we have inside our community. And it begs the question for me, like, why aren't there hundreds of J stringers out there helping us reverse the damage? I mean, I don't really know what is the purity culture still like really baked in right now to evangelical teaching? I mean, that's so in like air quotes, but are we on the other side of this sort of militant, anti-sex, anti-desire spiritual instruction, or no?
I'm seeing really good progress, but back to the Augustine point, like this is centuries long with regards to the church.
Yeah.
And so I am seeing some of the language shift, and some, I would say, authors, theologians are definitely starting to create more inroads of kind of developing a very kind and curious approach to sexual difficulties and how do you invite people to sex education. But one of the things that often happens is that parents, we can talk about parents more later, but a lot of parents get really fearful about educating their kids in terms of they don't want to awaken love too early.
Yeah.
And in part of what I say to that is like, it's either going to be your kids' middle school peers or the world of pornography that are going to educate your kids. And so you've got to make a choice. And so I think we're seeing some of that change, but this is going to take time and a lot of conversations like this to really change the conversation and the landscape of sexual development and difficulties in our time. So I'm one that I get criticized often on both sides because I think that the militant language is dreadful. It's awful. It has not done any good. It creates damage. But then the other side would just be, essentially more of a progressive leaning of, as long as no one's getting hurt and there is consent, then you can kind of do what you want. And I just think that there's so much more to invite people to be curious about why we're drawn to particular things. So I think that's where real growth comes in, is do not pathologize, but don't just like normalize everything, but get really curious about a sexual difficulty. Where does it come from? What might it be trying to teach you, to communicate to you? So I think if you can resist those kind of two dominant poles, you'll have a lot more just development in your sexual life, because none of us have received a comprehensive education. Licensed therapists like myself, ordained pastors have maybe received one class in their entire graduate training in sex or sexual. So it's just that sense of like, we don't fully understand our bodies. We don't understand how they work. And so I think just that it's a little bit of humility to recognize like there's so much more that I need to understand and learn about my body and the body of someone that I love.
So true. So ill-equipped. And then just out there with leaving science all behind. And just who cares, you know? Now, a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. We're talking to Jay today. And what I want to remind you is that there are many forms of therapy. For me, talk therapy, which I always do online, has played a critical role in my life. And I think that's why I always love to introduce or remind my community about options like BetterHelp online therapy. Because it's all online, BetterHelp can be a much more accessible, convenient, and also cost-effective point of entry for therapy. It's also less intimidating. Your therapist literally meets with you wherever you are. One of BetterHelp's North Stars is ensuring that you have a suitable therapist with a background and specialty that's right for you. So heart to heart and mind to mind. And if it turns out to not be a good fit, they'll fix it. So whether you've done therapy before or never at all, this is a great place to start. Do it for you. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp Online Therapy, and my podcast listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/forthelove. That's BetterHelp.com/forthelove. We are in the middle of another never-ending summer here in Texas, which means we're all facing spontaneous cremation. But whether you're living in Dante's Inferno like us, or you can actually walk outside without melting, it is important to stay hydrated. And I don't mean by iced coffee and skinny margaritas, all right? I'll be the first to admit that I haven't always been a model student when it comes to drinking my water. I've been on record as saying before, I've been trying to fix water for a long time. I think that's one reason I love liquid IV sticks. So like one stick of liquid IV in 16 ounces of water hydrates you 2 times faster and more efficiently than plain water alone. Plus, each stick has 5 essential vitamins, B3, B5, B6, B12, and vitamin C, and 3 times the electrolytes of traditional sports drinks. Liquid IV is also non-GMO and, of course, free of gluten and dairy and soy. Plus, for all those raising their hand like me who find plain water kind of uninteresting, Liquid IV has 10 delicious flavors, including like watermelon, lemon lime, tropical punch, and my favorites, pina colada and passion fruit. These Liquid IV sticks are also super convenient for traveling, because you just throw them in your purse and then just dump a stick in your water bottle on the go. So grab your Liquid IV in bulk nationwide at Costco, or you can get 25% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use the code FORTHELOVE at checkout. So you guys, that's 25% off anything you order when you shop Better Hydration today using the promo code FORTHELOVE at liquidiv.com. We're about to talk about parenting our kids through sexuality. And I'm so grateful for the way that you help us thread this needle. Because you're right. There's poles. Those are the 2 that I see. I cannot tell you how many times me and my friends have been like, what is this one in the middle? Like, where's that instruction? Like, who will help us not repeat the toxic patterns that we inherited, but not swing so hard? So we're going to get there in just a second. I just wonder if you just said, I love your posture of kind of curiosity toward whatever feels sexually dysfunctional, or it's not working, or, because a bunch of us came up through that culture. And of course we all got married. Most of us got married young, because what else are we going to do? We wanted to have sex. I
mean, our brains are not fully developed. Like the male brain is not developed until 26. And I think women definitely reach maturity, 25, 24, their brain development. But it's that sense of so many of the decisions that we make before our fully developed brain are, yes, we are. It's an extended adolescence when most of us are getting married.
I can see it now in hindsight with clear eyes, of course. At the time, when you're inside that narrative, everything makes sense. Because that's what everybody else is choosing and saying. It's the example that's being set for us. It's essentially the template handed to us. Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, better to get married than burn. And so what happened was a lot of us did indeed do the thing. We got married right there and then predictably, sex was difficult. It just, and I know that you know this, but just like for everybody listening, the dominant story that I heard as a girl coming up through purity culture was obviously we are not even sexual beings. We're just a receptacle, really. I mean, so first of all, nobody talked to us about sexual desire. That was for the boys. That was in the boys' room where they were with the deacon. But so nobody even gave us permission to love sex or want it or learn about it or figure out our own body. We can't touch ourselves. Yes. Are you kidding me? That's go straight to hell or lick the knife. You know, you're going to lick the knife. Shit. So we didn't have any, but of course we are sexual and we do like sex and we like all that. And so that was so shameful. Like, oh God, what is wrong with me? I'm like a slut, I guess. Cause that's not how I feel. But in addition to that, we were responsible for the boys. It was how we were dressing. It was the words we would choose to say. It was our responsibility. So many side hugs. Like if a boy wants to have sex with you, what have you done wrong? Like you should not wear spaghetti straps. I've told you a million times, you know, like
in my high school, we had two finger.
Oh, sure.
2 finger.
You think I don't know about the 2 finger? And also we would have the dollar bill above our knee and the shorts. If the shorts didn't touch the top of that dollar bill, back to camp. Girl,
we should create some dollar bill shorts. That just has a nice.
It could have been a merch item. Frankly, we had all the rest of it, and so we spent so much energy tamping down our own normal, natural, good sexuality, and then also worrying that we're unwittingly making the boys crazy sexually, and then. So it's just repression. And then we get married. And then we're supposed to be like every man's fantasy in the bedroom, like everything he's ever wanted.
Yes. Yeah.
That didn't work.
No.
I don't know if you know this, Jay, but it just didn't work. And so then there's all these women with all this residual like fear and shame around sex. And then it's not working with our husbands, but we don't know what to do about that because that's embarrassing. And of course, we thought something was wrong with us, naturally, that we were not the vixen that makes all this exciting and wonderful. And then it just keeps going. Then you're married for 25 years. Like, it's really hard to reverse. Can you talk for a minute about, because I know you work with a lot of women, that's been their sexual story. Can you talk a little bit about beginning the work of walking back, all of that, just like all of it, because I love how you say this is not a life sentence. We can have agency over our sexuality, even at our ages. Like it's not too late. I know this now. I'm grown and I have a new partner. I'm like, oh, I'm 47. Is it too late to learn new things? It is not. It is not too late. And so can you talk a little bit about that and how you began to instruct women specifically?
I mean, I think one of the profound opportunities with regard to our sexual life in the present is that we get to rewrite some of the scripts of our life. So as we think about, as women think about the script that has been handed to them, so that's from church history. Augustine, would say, he essentially said it would be better for someone to have sex outside of marriage than for a couple to have sex in the context of even marriage for the purpose of sexual pleasure.
Oh, gosh.
So that sense of like, that's where we're coming, so depressing. And so that sense of so much of female sexuality has been narrated and kind of seen through the lens of performance and patriarchy. And so that sense of like, what would it mean for you to own something of your own sexual story? So it used to orbit around church history. It used to orbit around your church community. maybe your father, your mother, certainly your boyfriend, husband, like just how did all that happen? And so what ends up happening is people are never invited to understand, like, what do I want my sexual story to look like? Like, what does pleasure look like? That's not just about orgasms and penis and intercourse, but, sex is more than just something that we do. It's all of us. And so when you begin to think about what are the experiences where you feel spiritually connected to God, what are these experiences that you actually really love your body? And sometimes it's not just the entitlement of your partner. Sometimes it's like, have you gotten exercise? Have you had self-care? Are you, putting, when you get on those airplanes and they always say, please secure your own oxygen mask before securing the oxygen mask of those around you. That sense of, are you doing that for yourself? Are you bringing kind of the things that bring pleasure and goodness in your life? And so I think one of the greatest myths out there is that you can't change your past. And in some ways, the past is far easier to change than the future, in that you can go back to that scared adolescent girl and you can begin to mother her. You can ask her, what are the things that you wish that you would have known back in the day? Or, you were never given any books on sexual health. And so I'm going to give you Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are. And we're going to read through that together and you can bring all of your questions. So some of that is that, parenting stuff, but get into a group of friends and go through a couple sexual health books and say, here's all the things that I've never learned before. And what are you learning? So I think, in Brené Brown's latest book, she quotes, I think, a German philosopher that says, the limits to my language are the limits to my world. And that's so true of all of our sexual world, is when we don't have language for what we're experiencing or what we coming out of, we aren't going to have language to be able to create a new sexual world. So we've got to educate ourselves. We got to get into community and start talking through this stuff in order to rewrite our sexual script.
I love that. That's been 100% true in my experience, that is just a place of both learning, but also in my friend group, that conversation just absolutely is expansive and helpful and destigmatizing in some regards. And those little levers matter. They do. They can pull you forward. I want to talk a little bit with you about, we started this a minute ago, but a bunch of us who grew up in this, we now have the teenagers. They live with us. We have them and it's their turn. And so we don't have a good model to pull from experientially, most of us. And we have weird ideas around teenagers, sex, and awakening. To your point, we get a little rattly and a little like, if I say it, then they're going to start having it. This is absurd, like chicken egg.
The research would say the exact opposite.
That's right.
As well.
Turns out there's no basis to that. It's just holdover
The more
residual.
you talk, the more children delay.
That's interesting.
There's that. Yeah.
Okay. I want to hear from you about, we don't want to repeat the sex shaming cycle. We don't want that.
No.
A bunch of us don't want to just say it's a free for all. Just get out there. And as long as you don't get like a disease or an unwanted pregnancy, sky's the limit. Like go at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Help us. Help us.
Yeah.
Help us create something different for our kids.
Yeah. So a couple of things would be, I think this is the most important, is that the greatest risk to your child is your unprocessed sexual life. And Carl Jung would say, I'm borrowing from Jung, but I can't remember his exact quote, but he says something like the greatest risk to a child is the unlived or unprocessed life of his or her mother. And that could be father as well. But that sense of like, so much more important than premarital sex, porn, is the energy that you're bringing to these conversations. So people like Dr. Dan Siegel, who have written just some of the best books on parenting, would all say that the number one predictor of kind of a child's health and development is for their parent to understand and transform their story. So view this as something of, I've got to heal so many of the energy, the wounds within us. And I think all of us approach sex with some level of embarrassment, with certain categories. Maybe there's some internal no-fly zone within you. And that would just be something of, go talk to a therapist, go talk to good friends about what you're uncomfortable with. But I think beyond that, the biggest goal is that we want parents to be their child's Google. So where parents don't educate middle school peers, porn will. And so there's a lot of variations about this in the sexual health community, but a lot of us grew up with that one singular talk with our parents.
That's right.
And so a lot of what we're trying to change is, instead of thinking about it as one 60-minute talk, think about this as 61-minute conversation.
That's good.
And so this would be two categories to begin to think about would be proactive conversations and responsive conversations. Okay. So a proactive conversation would be like, you're going to eventually have your period one day. And here are some books. And I can't tell you the amount of women that I've had in my caseload that were never told about their periods. And when they started menstruating, they thought that they were dying. Another proactive conversation would be, we know that when adolescent boys are about 13 years of age, they have the equivalent of about a shot glass of testosterone in their system. By the time you reach 15, that goes up to a pint glass. And so, I can't tell you the amount of men in my caseload that have said that something in them felt like it was becoming perverse or evil because they started having sexual desire, but were never taught about those things. So we want to give kids a lot of books. On my Instagram page, I've got kind of a whole list of sexual resources for parents that people can check out. But we want to have a lot of proactive conversations, because some kids will ask questions and some will not. And then the other category would be that of responsive. So one example of this is one of my kids' teachers was pregnant, and my son was like 6 or 7 at the time. And so he asked just a lot of those predictable questions of like, how are babies made? How does this work? And so my wife begins to answer for my son, and he says, okay. And then he says, Dad, what do you think? And I said, I do this for a living, and it's still somewhat difficult to be able to fully know how to translate. And I start talking about, penis, vulva, sex, pleasure. And the kid interrupts me, and he says, Dad, I think what you're trying to say is that your penis is a bow and Mom's vagina is a violin. And I just completely stopped. And I was like, I will never write or think about something like that ever again. And then my daughter, who was like 4 or 5 at the time, interrupts and says like, no, Daddy's penis is a guitar and only Mom gets to play it.
I can't.
So those are, I can't either. But those are examples of like, that was a really quick conversation around like, what is a vulva? What is a penis? And they're going to forget about it. But over the lifespan, you want to have more and more responsive things. So if you find out that there is sexting going on at your kid's school, bring that up and say, what do you think about this? And when you think about your own sexual story, would you want someone else to have access to those pictures? Would you want those pictures shared? Conversations around porn, we don't want to just entirely over pathologize things, but there are themes within porn and exploitation of like, we can talk about racism. We can talk about the fetishization and objectification of women. Just to view almost everything that you're seeing kind of on the news, when you're at a stoplight, you can have some of these conversations. So we want to layer more and more conversations with kids across the lifespan. So don't want to do it too early, but you also don't want to ignore it. So
that's right.
Figure out what to be proactive about and then what to be responsive about.
And that does get easier. Like I'm thinking about the person listening, just going, I'm so uncomfortable. It does get easier. Like some of the pressure valve opens and it's like, okay, no one's going to die. Like these are conversations we can have on the reg and we all live. And then you can have them easier. This is a hard question.
If you don't know
Go
it,
ahead.
just say it. Just if you don't know it, you can say, that's a really good question. Let me think about it. And I'll get back to you next week.
Totally.
And do your homework, but it does get easier. And usually parents have one or two things that they would love to talk to their kids about. It could be like, you're a nurse and you love anatomy and you can go there. And then there's usually one or two areas that make one or both parents really uncomfortable, and do some work around it. Buy a book.
That's good.
Talk to a friend first, because these subjects should be just as easy to talk about as you're talking about spelling or history or art supplies.
There is something so powerful about 61-minute conversations. It just takes the embarrassment piece out, and it normalizes sex, which it should be. It should be. Yes. Now, this is my question for you, and I don't really know if it has an answer, because I do know that every kid is different. Every family is different. Race plays into this. Gender plays into this. So I'm going to, it's a too simplified question to maybe have a good answer. But for those of us who are, we've got the boys with the pint inside their little bodies. We've got the girls. They're awakening. So we're north of 7. We're in like sexual space. This is when we're having boyfriends, we're having girlfriends. This is on the table. This is, what do you think healthy parenting looks like in that place with kids who are normally in a regular, normal, healthy way, sexually like interested, curious, developing? What's not all the way here and what's not all the way here?
So we don't want to militantly fight our children. So one of the things that happens often is like parents become helicopters, they try and clamp down. And one image that I think a lot about with regard to parenting is to think about yourself as you're encouraging your child to develop their own garden. And so are there going to be weeds to pick? Yes. But the purpose of the garden is not to clear out weeds. It's to be able to grow. And everybody's garden is going to look differently. So one of the images that I think a lot about in my own parenting is like that of a seed. And so for a seed to grow, it has to transgress the seed casing, and the root has to go down in order for the shoot to go up. And so just that sense of, our children need to transgress the boundaries in some ways that we have created in order for them to individuate, to be able to grow. And so we don't want to kind of like create soil that does not allow them to transgress kind of the boundaries of childhood. We want to allow some of that transgression to grow. And I think that begins by inviting them to consider, like, what do you want your own sexual story to look like? And you don't have, they don't have to tell you, it doesn't have to get that into, but it's that question of, where do you want this to go? Like, what types of pleasure, what types of goodness? When you think about a dating relationship, what would that look like if it wasn't coercive and it wasn't just something that was a free-for-all? And I think most kids actually want to bring a level of honor to them. So for parenting, this is a very oversimplified understanding of attachment theory, but kids need attunement and they need containment. So a mentor of mine, author Dan Allender, kind of says that every child is asking 2 core questions. Am I loved and can I get my own way? And so that question has to be, that's a question of attunement, right? Like, do you delight in your child? And do they know that, home is the foundation of delight? They don't have to go out looking to distant horizons in order to find someone who loves and delights with them. If you don't delight in your child's fashion, if you don't delight in the music that they're listening to, what you're doing is you're saying, I am a rigid parent. And if you're going to find your life and identity, you're going to need to look out elsewhere. So a parent's delight for their child sets the foundation. And then that level of containment is also the sense of being able to say no to a child. And so that might look like, as parents and as a family, we're going to put our cell phones on the kitchen counter at 11 o'clock at night, or the router is going to go off. And that's kind of our rule within our family, because we want you getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, like the average adolescent, I think their attention span is only about 65 seconds before they're moving on to something else. The average teenager today is exposed to over 9 hours of media. And so that's messing with so many things in life. So I think some boundaries around tech is really important, but then you're also not militantly engaging them. So one of the, I can't remember where I heard this, Jen, but on one of the podcasts that you were on, you were talking about codependency. Maybe it was yours. And just that sense of, a lot of us think about codependency, it's somewhat right, but that sense of like, what are the consequences to their own actions that we prevent them from having? That's and so as a good parent, you want to allow your kids to have some of the consequences instead of just rigidly controlling them. So I think if you can focus on that, like really good attunement, and then also really good containment and a lot of conversations, you're going to put really good soil around your child for them to develop a very healthy sexual development and emotional development. So give them lots of resources, education, books, conversations, and allow that goodness within them to grow.
That's really good. Those can't be discredited. The scaffolding that we build around our kids as they like come of age sexually, all that really does matter. It really plays in. And so I think a lot of times what we're looking for right now as parents, we want like, what's the script, Jay? Like, what are the words? Like, what's the rules? What do we say? But like that stuff is monumental. And, then what happens is I cannot wait for your kids to be able to, I am not even kidding. You're going to come back when your kids are teenagers and we're going to have this conversation again because.
And I'm going to say, I'm so sorry. I was all wrong.
It's going to be like, God, they say too much. Like, why'd we create such an open environment? Like all my kids are here. My daughter turned 22 yesterday. So we had a big family party. Everyone's here. She's still here. She spent the night with her best friend. Anyway, my son's here.
Yes.
And we were in the kitchen last night about midnight or 1. And I just was having the thought, I'm like, I gave them the impression that they could say anything to me. And now they do. Like, now they do. And I wish I didn't have ears. Say? Like, I just, it's all of it. It's all these things. We
give them language to critique us.
Then they use it. But also they're like comfortable talking about their sexuality to me and what kind of expression it's finding out in the world right now. And
is there.
I'm like, shit. I mean, like I wanted theoretically to be a part of this with you, but now that it's happening, I don't like it here. I don't like it here. And so what I'm just saying to you is what you're saying is right. If you show yourself to be safe and that you love your children and that you're comfortable in these conversations and they don't have to like dodge your squidgy feelings about it. And you're like horror. Well, sure enough, you're right. They'll come to you. They'll bring their questions.
Yeah. And my daughter has a couple books on like there's like a girl's book for girls ages like 8 to 12 or something. And she will periodically just take that off the bookshelf and start reading it. And then will tell me about what's going to happen to her body one day. It's so sweet and kind.
So sweet.
But then she also, to your point around the 22-year-old, I mean, this is what she said to me at 6, no fabrication. We were in an argument. There was a rupture. I was angry with her and she just paused and she said, Dad, do you really want this to be the face of my father that I see for the rest of my life?
Oh my God. This is a therapist kid right there. You've given her the language.
No, I'm sorry. That's not.
Don't want that.
So that was the first thought that followed very quickly.
I die.
It's like 10 years from now, I'm just going to like disintegrate.
Faith can be such a polarizing topic in our culture today. Like in an era where your religious beliefs might be all mixed up with your political views, your moral compass, and your perspective on others who believe differently, man, many of you know that my own faith journey has not been without lots of mess and debris and rubble, but what has been rebuilt, I would not exchange for anything in this world. The mess and all that wrestling with faith, it became beautiful. And I'm here to tell you that it can for you too. I've heard from so many of you in this community that you are experiencing tension in this category too. You're not alone for sure. Maybe it's a complicated relationship with church. Maybe some things just aren't sitting right. Things that you were taught early on. Maybe you're having trouble answering hard questions on big issues. It's one of the reasons I wanted to put together a me course, which is my e-course series, on the topic of faith, specifically the process of deconstruction and then reconstruction. It can be very isolating to be in a space of questioning, but I am here to tell you that asking questions and going through this process is not something to be seen with shame or negativity. Like, it's the exact opposite. The incredible Sarah Bessey of Evolving Faith joins me for this me course too. She is my favorite leader in this space. I'm so honored to put this particular course in your hands. It's 4 beautiful sessions that will comfort you and educate you and inspire you and load you up with tons of resources for where to find community and support in your journey, books to read, resources to follow, so much more. So head over to mecourse.org to learn more. This course on faith and deconstruction and reconstruction is my 5th e-course. So we have a library of other options for you too, along with some incredible bundle offers for savings on all the courses. So check it all out at mecourse.org. I want you to leave us here with your best pep talk. I'm going back to women now. I'm going back to like grownups who, whether they're in the same marriage they've been in for 100 years, or they're like me, they're like starting over somewhere in the middle of their life in a way they either probably didn't plan on. And they've got their sexual history is whatever, not great in any range of, for any range of reasons. I'd love to hear you sort of give us the hopeful, it's not too late. You can, you're not stuck. There's nothing wrong with your sexual desires. They can be awakened or reshaped. I'm giving you the answer. I'm leading the witness.
I know I don't
I'm leading the witness,
talks, but the listeners are hearing a very good pep talk right now.
I'd like to hear your therapy talk toward that person who's like, could this ever be like a wonderful part of my life? Sex.
Yes. So I think about it. I don't know why the word repentance came to mind, but a lot of us, think about repentance as just feeling like crap about who we are. And so I think for a lot of us that grew up within purity culture and have had a lot of sexual shame, repentance is about feeling joy. It's about kind of going to the table of a feast that's thrown in your honor. And so that sense of, what do you want your sexual life to look like? And for some of us, we don't even have, because the nature of trauma, Jen, is that it's fragmentation. And so for a lot of people who have been traumatized in their own marriages, who have been traumatized in purity culture, you don't even have an imagination. And so you might need to be able to go see a therapist and be able to talk through some of the fragments and some of the shame. Because shame, to Brené Brown's great definition, this very painful experience that something in me is unwanted or unworthy of love or belonging. And that's true in the left brain, but but shame is far more a right brain experience of like, I just feel like crap. I feel unwanted. I feel unlovable. There's something in my core that just feels off. And so being able to see a therapist, to be able to process and put language to some of that fragmentation is what initially allows a level of imagination to grow. For others, there's a sense of like, you're listening to this podcast and a lot of your own stories are coming up and you are pissed off. And I would say, bless that defiance, that defiance is being able to say like, that world needs to die. It was an evil world that created just a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, just think about the Southern Baptist churches. I know a lot of great Southern Baptist church ministers, but for the organization, some of the dynamite, horrendous findings that just came out in the spring of 2022 were awful. So the Southern Baptist Convention is promoting purity pledges while they're covering up sexual abuse and abuse of power. So that ought to make us angry. And so that anger isn't unto destruction, but it's unto building something really beautiful. And so I think that would be part of the question is like, where do you want your sexual story to go that's not narrated through the lens of patriarchy, through something very harmful? And just understanding, I think I mentioned this earlier, but sex is not just about intercourse and penis and clitoris. It's about like this full expression of who we are. And so maybe sex is not something that you feel a lot of desire for because it has been planted in your brain that you're just supposed to feel desire all the time. And so for you, it might be a sense of being able to say no, so that you can do the work to understand, like, what do I really want from the sexual life? And so what I find in all of my clients, I'm talking around this issue, but sex is the stage to be able to rewrite so much of the history of your life. And so if there are portions of your story that you don't like, things that you feel embarrassed by, ashamed of, sex is a crucible that is going to ask you to work through your shame, work through your inability to receive or to give pleasure. And so I would just honor that process of this. This isn't supposed to be entirely easy, but it's in our integrity with what is difficult that we begin to change. And
that's so good.
I wish I had better language, but
no, that's so good.
Not a pep talker.
No, that was a pep talk.
That was a pep talk.
Congratulations. You're a pep talker now. That's who you are now, Jay. That was so good.
Jay,
that was so helpful. And
but view sexual difficulties as a stage to be able to rewrite your story.
I just absolutely love that. And that can happen at any moment. Like, the thing about me and having kind of lived my story in front of a lot of people for the last 2 years, you begin to
front row seat for all of us.
It's a lot.
That doesn't do any trauma.
No, it's a lot to take in, all, right? Admittedly. But you begin to attract people who have a similar story, right? Like, because it's just the community around it is a comfort and a hope. Like, depending on where we are in the continuum, someone's ahead of me, someone's behind me, and we're all just tugging each other down the road. But the wonderful little side benefit of this is that I now have all these women in my community who are like, I just rediscovered love. I'm 71. I'm 71. I fell in love. Yes. We're having sex. I'm like, well, yeah, you're not dead. Like, I just love it. Like, I just love seeing that the boundaries of what freedom can look like, healing, starting over, learning. Apparently there's no end. Yeah. There's just no end. It can keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where I love that seed imagery of like, we have to transgress the seed casing that was really good to preserve us in a way, but and that's the seed, the root has to go down, and we go down into depth. We go down into grief. We go down into the heartache of our life in order for that shoot to emerge. And so, to your point, I've listened to a few of your podcasts in the season, and that's the imagery that came. Like, you have been in a lot of grief and heartache over the last couple of years, and have done so with so much integrity and honor. But your root needed to go down.
That's right.
In order for the shoot of the Genaissance to fully emerge. This. And that's the work for all of us, is what in us needs to weep, to wail, to rage at what has been done against us, and grieving the perpetration of church history. And we need to go down. We need to grieve that. We need to enter our story. And as we do that, as that root goes down, there's something lovely of what that shoot can emerge in our lives that really brings about flourishing and goodness, not only to our lives, but the one that we choose to love. And that's the work, is go down into grief in order that beauty might emerge.
Oh, well, we have to end on that. That's the perfect finale. What a good pep talk. That's a better
pep talk.
It's the best pep talk I ever heard, to be honest with you. Okay. This is where we're going to end it. Now, this is full circle, because this is what you and I were talking about before I started. Well, actually, I was recording, but we were just talking.
I'm dreading this question. This is the question I know is coming.
Yeah, exactly. And I've already asked it to you one time. And listener, the last time I asked Jay what was saving his life right now, he talked about his scooter. He lives in New York, and he's like got a fun, fancy New York life, and he scooters around. This is just how people do in the city.
Fun and fancy.
Not a week late. Just, okay. I'm not going to steal your thunder.
Days later.
Days later, on his scooter, which was saving his life, he fell and broke both elbows. So I'm afraid that I'm going to manifest something insidious in your life by asking this again. So please choose carefully.
I know. No, I've had to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you asked me what was saving my life, and I loved electric scooters at the time, and was going down a hill. The wheel went left and my body tumbled forward and broke both of my elbows. And I mean, probably within 2 or 3 minutes of that happening, I remembered our conversation. Just that sense of like, I had just said this was a place of joy and delight for me. And now it is a place of suffering in my, my head, my elbows hit concrete. So
they did. So I don't know what you're going to say this time, but I hope no harm comes to it. Like, I hope we don't.
I've already been praying against harm.
Okay.
It's a tough question, but I would say, and I know you get this as well as an author, but when I wrote my book Unwanted, I wrote a lot of this back in like 2015. It was published in 2018, and nothing prepared me for like what would become of my life with that book. And so what I ended up doing was deprioritizing my heart and my soul in terms of what I really wanted next. And so I had listened to a podcast years ago by, I think it was Rob Bell, could have been someone else, but he had talked about how him and his wife were at a fundraising event, and, you know, really good event. But they looked at each other and they're like, why are we here? Like, really good cause, but like, we don't get time together nearly enough. And so the point that he made is that the good can become the enemy of the best. And that has been cornering me massively this year, is that, you know, I say yes to a lot of really good things, but they are not the best. And so a couple of weeks ago, I started saying no a whole lot more. And I cleared out my schedule, and I've been sitting on my next book for years around all of these topics and working through sexual and relational difficulties. And I'm in my studio in Manhattan right now, and I was in here for 14 to 16 hours a day just writing, and I felt like an artist again. And I was getting up at like 5 a.m. writing, coming home, being with, you know, family for 2 or 3 hours, and then I'd come back here and just burn the midnight oil. And I felt so alive because I was prioritizing that. So I think that's truly what's saving my life right now, is prioritizing joy and prioritizing meaning. And I have not done a good job of prioritizing the things and the people that really bring me life. And there's a defiance in me that's growing to say, like, hell no, will good things steal joy and meaning in life for me? So,
oh, I am banging this drum for you too. I love this. I had to learn this in earnest a few years ago for the exact same reason. And I read Essentialism by Greg McKeown. I don't know if you've read it, but
I haven't read it, but I've read chapters of it. Yeah.
His little phrase that he handed me, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no, has seen me through. Like that became my like battle cry. Like if it's not a hell yes, and not, turns out not a lot of things are hell yeses. Most of my things were like, sure's. Okay, like medium yes. Or I feel like I should yes. Or I feel bad to say no yes. The hell yeses, which he put, they have to be a 90% or above. Anyway, I cannot recommend his work more if this is what you're deciding to do and you're like, it is liberating. So I am thrilled for you. I love this. And listen, I know that you're defiant and I know that you're stubborn because, listener, the same week that Jay broke both of his elbows on his beloved scooter, that week, am I getting this right? 1 week later, he ran a marathon.
Days later.
Days. Yeah. He'd been training and he was like, well, hell, what am I going to just flush my training down I'm going to run the marathon with 2 broken arms. So,
and so
I just want to say you're stubborn.
I'm very stubborn.
Yeah.
My wife would concur. Yeah. And a lot of that was peer pressure. I had friends sending me the Michael Jordan flu game memes where he played in the finals with like 104 temperature. And then my son said, you will either be a legend, an idiot, or a fool. And so taunting of friends and family definitely encouraged the stupidity. But yes, to defiance.
I mirror this energy so much. I'm an Enneagram 3. There's not a thing I would not see. I will run that ball over the finish line. I don't care. I do not care. I'll set a record. So to me, I'm like, respect. Okay. I'm so excited you're writing your next book. I'm not surprised also to hear it's just pouring out of you and it's all right under the surface for you. Like this is what you do. So this is thrilling. Like, what do we have to wait? Another year? Look at me. I'm like, what's the end game?
It's still working at this point with getting the agent landed and then publishing contracts. So there's just so much in me that I want to write and want to prioritize. So hopefully soon, but there are some minor obstacles in the way.
I'm 100% behind everything you're going to write and give us, all the ways that you lead us. Thank you now for leading in my space, not once, but twice.
Thank you for inviting me twice.
Well, it's just going to be the last. So you know what this is for you? It's a hell yes, just in case you're not sure. Let me just hand that to you.
For me. No, it was a very easy hell yes. When my assistant said, not Jen, but Jen's people want you back.
That's right. And I did.
Hell yes.
I'm in that. I'm part of the people. So
I know you are the queen that gives the decree, but your people.
Okay, that's it. You need to go back to the work of your day and thank you. And so everybody, I'll have everything Jay related like up for you, all the links, all the things, all the places to follow him, all his work, all his books, all his suggestions, everything. So don't worry. Influx of women coming your way yet again. Hey, thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, Jen, thank you.
Great to see you.
Likewise.
All right, you guys, so much in that good conversation. As promised, I will collect all things Jay Stringer for you. If you go over to jenhatmaker.com under the podcast tab, I'll have this episode. I will have all the show notes. I will have every link that you want to Jay's socials, to his content, to his book, everything. You're going to want to follow him. He's such a good leader for us. And I'm just cheering for you as you like examine maybe your sex life or your desires or your habits and patterns, your relationships. I'm definitely cheering for those of you like me who are out there in a new way. And you're with a new partner halfway through your damn life, right? And how like both wonderful and exciting and also new and unfamiliar some of that is. Like Anyway, I am Team You, and this whole series is Team You and relationship, and I am thrilled for it. And so you're not going to want to miss any. Like I said, it's a 9-part episode or a 9-part series because we just have so much to say around sex and relationships, dating, all of it. And so come back. You're not going to want to miss a single one. If you haven't already, you guys go ahead and subscribe to the show. And you'll never miss an episode ever. It'll come right to your little inbox. And you can either subscribe just into the audio version, just listen in your AirPods, or as you know, we also video every single interview, and it's over on my YouTube channel if you'd like to watch the conversation, and which I always, of course, prefer. So anyhow, glad you're here. Can't wait to bring you more. Absolutely thrilled about every single guest in this series, and I know you're going to be too. All right, you guys, see you next week.